Hello again, class. Thank you for coming and listening to another session here on second language acquisition. Today we're going to be looking at cross-linguistic influences, how one's first language, one's first culture can influence how a student learns another language. So we'll take a look at cross-linguistic analysis, some influences. We'll take a look at what errors are, differences between errors and mistakes, talk a little bit about stabilization, and then we'll end up with form-focused instruction, or basically spending time when you're learning to actually focus on some of the more specific low-level grammar type of concepts. Let's begin by talking a little bit about contrastive analysis hypothesis, or CAH. Contrastive analysis hypothesis began somewhere like in the 1960s, and the belief here is that the principal barrier to second language acquisition is the interference that one has from their first language. These the interference of the first language system with the second language system. So there's this language system already in the person's head, be it Spanish or French or Javanese, and when they're trying to learn a second language, that the learner is using those first language rules to try to understand and build up on the second language rules, and that can create a barrier. Additionally, there's a scientific structural analysis of the two languages is going to reveal where those problems are going to occur. And it's going to enable linguists to predict where the difficulties are that language learners might have. And basically what that means is that there is the belief that if there are two systems and this language system has a definite article, but this one doesn't have a definite article, it's going to be harder for this learner, it's going to be harder for the learner without that definite article to learn a language where there is a definite article. And similarly for someone who knows English, when they're trying to learn Spanish, trying to recognize and remember where to use L and where to use la is going to be a little more difficult because we don't have that demarcation in our language. So you look at the two languages, you compare, and where they overlap, that's where there's probably going to be an issue. Where they're the same, then it's going to be easier to learn. And that's the basic idea behind this contrastive analysis hypothesis. Now, it seems to make sense, okay? And I already understand what a verb is, so I'm going to be able to understand it somewhere else. And if I'm learning English and my language doesn't have person, in other words, different verbs for the number of people or the first person, second person, or third person type of demarcation, our language, we have that. Languages that don't have it, when they come to learn English, it's going to be more difficult because they don't have it in their language. Okay, I hope you're understanding this. Another example that I often talk about are students who don't have certain sounds in their language. Again, I remember Korean students coming and I want to use the phone. And they want to use the phone because they don't have the sound PH, the sound F, phone, in their language. So phone becomes pon. They didn't know how to make the switch because they don't have it in their language. Okay, that's one of those places that overlap, so it's more difficult. Now, there's the strong version of the contrastive analysis hypothesis that Lado, who was a researcher and a linguist, in the 1950s, I believe, he went on to claim that a teacher could predict where those areas of difficulty were going to be. In other words, I could use it as a scientific tool to clearly point to where some problems are going to be. And later that was found out not to be actually the case, that Martin created a hierarchy of difficulty, but the weaker version is probably more accurate. Okay, the weaker version basically said that there is cross-linguistic influence, okay, but they can't specifically predict where it's going to be. They're just going to be able to say this was probably going to be an issue. This is probably going to be difficult for students. Not always the case, but again, if there is an overlap, if there's a place where they don't match up, there's a greater likelihood that that's going to be a problem. Now, there are different types of errors. There are intralingual errors, and there are interlingual intralingual errors. Okay, intra is within one language. Students understand a rule and then they try to apply that rule to other places. Okay, and the rule doesn't apply everywhere, so they make a language within. They make an error within the language. And there are interlanguage issues where I don't know how to solve this problem, this language problem. I want to say, you know, go to the beach, but I don't know how to say to the beach in this in English, but I do know how to say it in my language. So let me take the structures that I've learned from my language and try to apply them to English. And if it doesn't work, that's an error, but that's not an intralingual, that's an interlingual error. Understand the difference? I hope so. Contrastive analysis is actually a very powerful tool that teachers can use. Again, I would recommend you use the weak version. But if you know two languages and you begin to see where these two languages cross over and you can start to identify what those problems are, you can prepare for that ahead of time. I know that when I teach Japanese students English, almost invariably I will have a problem with adverb clauses. In English, adverb clauses are not sentences. In Japanese, adverb clauses can be a sentence, right? Because I was sick, period, can be a sentence. And invariably I have many students who have problems understanding that it's not a sentence. Because again, in their language, stealing from their language, it is a sentence, so they can come in and do that. Good thing to know if you have those languages. Another way to talk about some of the difficulties in language is this concept of markedness, and how special, I guess you could use the word is, for a particular word. The markedness differential hypothesis basically states that within a pair of structures, okay, for example, articles, again, we could look at. If one of them is more marked and one of them has more requirements or more differentiation or more options, it's going to be more difficult to understand. Let me just read what we have here. Within a pair of related structures, one of the structures, the marked one, will have at least one more feature than the other one, than the unmarked one. Okay, and if that's the case, the marked one is going to be more difficult to understand. Okay, marked structures are often more difficult than unmarked ones. Learning phonology or morphology can be impacted by the markedness differential hypothesis. So when you're trying to learn sounds, when you're trying to learn morphologies or morphemes, it's going to be easier to, generally speaking, it's going to be easier for people to learn the elements that have less markedness in them, that have less requirements, that are less stringent. And again, generally that's the case. There's two elements that are generally involved here. One is markedness, the other is frequency of use. And so we may have structures that are more difficult, but they're used all the time. And because they're used all the time, although initially they may be more difficult to understand, because they're used all the time, that difficult ratio is going to go down quickly, and they're going to be able to use it. In English, we have structures that aren't used very often, and because they're not used often, they're more difficult even for native speakers to learn. So again, the markedness differential hypothesis is definitely a good idea. You understand that things that are more difficult or more complex, they have more requirements, more rules in understanding them, then it's going to be more difficult, generally speaking, for students to understand them. A good example would be a reduced clause. And if you all remember what a reduced clause is in English, it's where you have a regular, adjective clause. The man who is standing by the car, right? Who is standing by the car? We have a marker, who. We have a subject, who. And we have is standing, the verb, right? Well, if I get rid of the who, the man standing by the car, okay, standing by the car now is a clause that's been reduced because you got rid of the marker and we got rid of the be verb. Students who are learning clauses are going to have more of a difficulty in learning this particular clause because it's got more requirements. Now, with the markedness differential hypothesis, they're actually talking about differences between languages, but you get the point here that because there are more limitations, there are more requirements in the structure, it's going to be more difficult. Okay. Next example here of markedness is this whole idea of the competition model. Students are going to use a number of different alternatives to try to create meaning beyond the L1. Okay, so initially they may try to transfer directly from their language into the target language. In this case, it would be English. Maybe they're going to try to use something that they understand within English to try to answer. But there's going to be a competition of ideas, competition of ways to try to get them to convey their idea. The better student is going to have a richer repertoire of tools at their disposal to try to convey their meaning. And again, they're just going to be able to use different ones. And I know I have done that. I do that when I'm speaking and I'm in an area that I don't quite understand, or I'm in an area that I have limited vocabulary. I'm going to try to use a variety of tools to try to explain my ideas. Second language learning is a dynamic, creative process of system development, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to develop the system of language in their head, okay? But it's a dynamic process, and as they're trying to develop, they're going to do trial and error, and they're going to use a number of these different sources, including their first language, to try to explain. They're going to try to use the second language. They may use communicative competence. They may use learning strategies. They may use their own life experiences to try and get their meaning across, or to try to understand what's going on. Okay, again, the more tools they have that they understand, more tools that they can have at their disposal, the better off they're going to be. I think I've mentioned at one point when I was trying to learn language and someone has said something to me, and I don't know what they mean, I ask them, can you say that again? I'm trying to get information from them. Can you say that again? And maybe they try to say it in different words, and maybe I can understand the synonyms or the alternative explanation. Maybe I don't, and if I don't, I ask them, to use that word in a sentence, right? And so now I'm trying to pull another, I'm trying to get them to do things for me. Or the inverse, where I'm trying to say something, and maybe I try to grab English words and I Japanize them, or maybe I try to take an idea that I know in Japanese and try to tweak it into a different area or a different idea. So there are different tools that you can use, and the more tools that you have, the better. Markedness means that it's going to be more difficult for someone to learn because there are more rules, there are more restrictions, and the like, okay, if you're going to be comparing between the two languages. Language learning requires making mistakes, and mistakes are good. So if you're going to be learning language, you should be prepared to go out and make mistakes. And students who are not prepared to go out and make mistakes are going to be students who are frustrated. Learning involves making mistakes, and mistakes are good. A mistake, there's a difference here between a mistake and an error, but generally speaking, mistakes are good because you learn from them. Mistakes are actually a random guess, a slip, an oops, a noticeable incorrection that are self-correctable. In other words, a mistake is something that you know the right answer, but because of something you give the wrong answer. And we do this even in English. The famous line from the original Willy Wonka movie with Gene Wilder, where he says, there's so much time and so little to do. And then he says, oh, stop, turn that around. There's so much to do and so little time, which is what he intended to say. But he made a mistake. He made an oops. He made a self-correcting error because he could hear his problem. That was a mistake. Okay, it was unintentional. We do that with language all the time. An error, on the other hand, is where you actually perform some linguistic function and you do not do it properly. You think you do, but you're not. An incorrect language production is something that is unknown to the learner. So you're saying something and you believe it's correct, but it's not. Okay, it's not correct. So that's an error. Errors enable the study of error analysis. So you can now study errors. And when you hear an error, and as soon as actually making an error, now you can analyze that. What causes that error? What do you do with that error? And that's another area of study that people can do research in. Error analysis requires the observation of errors, right? And obviously these are speaking and writing errors. They're not listening and reading errors. Although they do exist, you can't test those very well because they're hidden. Okay, so they're errors, and so they call these the absence of errors. Errors that you can't see because you can't analyze how one. The only way you can analyze it is to use speaking and listening. And so there are errors there, but you can't really test them so well. Speaking and writing errors, obviously, you can test and analyze much better. Error analysis. You want to identify and describe the errors, and that's not an easy thing to do because someone may be making a mistake, but you don't necessarily know why. The other thing is that you may not be able to do it because the errors are not consistent. Sometimes someone produces the correct utterance, sometimes they don't produce the correct utterance. So is that an error or is that a mistake? Is that an error, or were they just not concentrating that first time? I don't know. And then again, how do you describe what that is? It does require a lot of thinking, a lot of analyzing. What exactly did they mean by this? To try to identify what the error is. Okay, well, this student, me go store, right? Well, there's a lot of errors there, but did you understand what they were intending to say? And how did they get there? And of course, it's an error, but I can now analyze it. I can analyze why they did it. I can analyze what they intended to say. I can analyze how to help them circumvent, how to help them overcome that error so that they don't have it in the future. There are overt errors, okay? They're easily discernible. Okay, Pischetti, you can hear them very easily and you can understand what the mistake was. Some of them are covert errors. They're hard to figure out. You make an error, but why? And some of the reasons why that's hard to figure out is because you as a language teacher have never thought about it. So, for example, if I begin a sentence with not going is easy. Okay, well, why can I say not going? Don't you normally begin with a subject? How is it that you can do that? And you've got people who say, why is it that you can't do that? And they're going to think about it. It's harder to figure out the grammatic structure that originally existed and how we can change that. Or how you describe it, right? I mean, we understand how because works, right? I went to the store because I needed to buy milk. Because I need, okay, it's an adverb clause, okay. I went inside because of the rain. Because of the rain? Is because a preposition? Well, no, it's not. But, well, why do you use because of? What does that thing mean? Okay, and so now again, people are starting to think, oh, gee, why is that? What do you use that? You've got to think about it. You may have to do some research, try to figure out what it is, because it's hard to figure out. It may be grammatically fine, but there's something that's wrong there, something that's missing. There are different types of errors. There are errors of addition, where you add an extra word. I have a daughter who doesn't understand conditional sentences very well, so she'll say, unless if you do this. In case if you do this. And no matter how many times I would be telling her this, for some reason she has it in her head, she's adding this extra word. There's errors of omission, where you're taking things out. Errors of substitution, where you're switching one word for another, right? Or one sound for another, as in the example of Pischetti. There might be an ordering issue, where the students aren't putting the things in their right order. And so, those are things that you want to be looking for, things that you can analyze. Is it an error, an addition, or is it an omission, a substitution, or an ordering type of issue? There's also something else you can analyze is the scope of an error. Anybody who's analyzed someone's writing can understand this. For example, someone who has problems with run-on sentences will have that problem in most of their sentences. It's global. The problem is global. So when I deal with students, almost invariably, they will have problems with articles, and it's everywhere. So it's a global thing. It could be a local thing also. The errors are just localized. You only have the problem in one section of your speech, or one type of speech, or one type of your writing where you have an error. You may have, okay, so we're talking about the scope. Is it everywhere? Is it only in just one area? You can also talk about the domain. Is it something that's small, or is it something that's large that you have this error in? So, for example, is it phonemic? Is it a sound that you just have this error, which, again, if it's phonemic, it's probably global. It's global and small, because everywhere you go, you don't pronounce the S properly. You don't pronounce the TH properly, right? It's a small thing, but you hear it everywhere. So there's some people, for example, they say TH, they say like an F, what do you think? I want to go with you. And that problem, it's small, it's just a phoneme, but it's everywhere, right? And then you've got the larger ones, which are discourse types of errors, where people have difficulty understanding the proper communique that goes back and forth, okay? And that's a larger thing. And then you have sources of errors, which I talked about before. We have interlingual problems because my language and the language I want to learn have some things that don't jive, and so I can't carry things over. And then there's intralingual, where I'm within the language that I want to learn. I'm within the target language, but the differences that I have, the things that I want to say, make it give me problems within the language. I think this word I can use in 4 or 5 places, but I can only actually use it in one type of thing. Okay? Error analysis is rather interesting. If you're getting involved in computers and language, you'll want to be doing stuff like this because people are trying to create computerized language capable systems so that, you know, your phone can talk to you and it'll sound natural, and they'll be able to understand the heuristics that are involved in language creation. Some interesting things. Stages of learner development. Students are learning, they're going to be making certain types of errors. Beginning, they're going to be making random errors. In other words, that's nothing that's necessarily systematic. This is pre-systematic because they have no idea, they've got no structure at all, so they're just shooting out things and they're making just errors all over the place. As they begin to learn and have a kind of a structural understanding of what's going on, they begin to make emergent errors. Okay, the system is growing and they're beginning to develop distinct errors in certain areas, and so that's beginning to happen. You're going to see it more. You still have some random, and you still have people who are taking 3 steps forward and then they're coming back a little more as far as their language learning is concerned. It's not just a straight route. Okay, they're going to go forward a little, they're going to come back a little, simply because the brain is still trying to do all this stuff with the interlanguage. You remember what the interlanguage is, right? Selinker, when he talked about the rules inside the head and how they change as students recognize the differences between what native speakers use and their own language. They keep changing those rules so they can get them right with what native speakers are doing. Step 3 is systematic errors. Okay, these are now people who are, they're intermediate at some sort, and they understand a lot of the things that are going on, but they continue to make consistent errors in a certain area. Okay, these are now more specific type of errors. They're probably going to be more global because they're beginning to understand the foundations of the language. And finally, they get to stabilization, where they get high enough in language understanding that they don't make consistent errors, or their errors become fossilized. It's an error that they make, and they're always going to make it no matter what they learn, because they've fossilized that error. They've decided this is it, and I'm not going to try to change it anymore. Oftentimes, stabilization and fossilization occur because of 1 or 2 reasons. One, because the student has progressed so high in their language learning that they are mimicking native speakers, and the other is they're tired of studying. So the second reason is what is called fossilization, where students learn to a certain point and then they're done learning. They don't want to learn anymore, and they're just going to coast. They're just going to use the second language that they've learned. And they may be very good. They may be native in their ability to communicate, but they still may have pronunciation errors or writing errors, and they don't care. So they fossilized, right? Variation in language learning is due to a number of things. So people learn language differently, and then the actual learning of content is going to be different. Learning of language is going to be different because of a variety of things. One is the content. What is the material that the students are learning? Is it an area that is of interest to them? Is it an area that they need to learn? And depending on what those are, it's going to impact how they learn language. Again, students who are not interested in learning astronomy and yet they're studying astronomy, their motivation is going to go, right? They're going to be less interested in learning, and that's going to impact them. Psychological factors that are going on. Well, how is their affective filter? How is their emotional state? How is their ability to process that information within their brain? So there are a number of factors that can influence that. Social context, the social location that they're in. They may be interested in learning language, but they may hate all of their neighbors. They may hate the environment that they're in. They may not be getting good encouragement from the people around them, and that's going to impact the language that they learn. Might be the opposite as well. They might be in an environment where everybody loves them, everybody wants them to learn, and they're trying to help them learn. They're going to learn more quickly that way. Okay. Another psychological factor is just the person's own will to learn. They may have no self-esteem. They may have no self-confidence, and it's going to impact their ability to process language. The last point here is language function. What are the functions that they're learning, right? Again, are they practical to the student, or are they required for the course? If the student finds the language functions useful and practical to them, they're going to be more interested in doing that. Fossilization or stabilization, I've already talked about. Let's run on here to errors in the classroom. What do you do with errors? Do you ignore them? Do you try to do incidental noticing, or do you notice them indirectly, or do you notice them directly? And what we talk about by this is, how do you respond to someone who has an error? Do you stop them and say, no, that's not right, it's this way? Okay, that's directly correcting them, right? Do you do it indirectly? You know, someone said, you know, I go to the store, and then you turn, oh, you went to the store? Okay, you try to put that back on them, only in correct form, to hope that they kind of notice that. Okay, that's more indirect. Or do you ignore it? Do you not say anything and let them do it incidentally, as they're listening to other people, or as they just kind of pick it up? You know, which one do you use? My opinion is definitely hooked into this thing right here. Watch the affective filter. There are going to be some students who have the gumption, the strength to receive direct correction, and for them, give it to them, because they can handle it. And if there are ways that you can give that to them and still encourage them, great, do that. Now, for those that maybe have more issues with self-confidence or you know, believability, do it more indirectly. Okay. So you want to be able to implement this in such a way that it's going to keep their affective filter not too high and not too low, but you can also be pressing them on those errors. Ignoring the errors is not as effective, but it also keeps their motivation higher. It's the same idea as you know, you've got this mountain that you need to climb. Do you go around it 15 times? Do you go around it, you know, this way so that it's easier, or do you go up and over? Going up and over would be like the direct route, but it's also more difficult. And the indirect route might take longer as far as language learning, but it's also going to be more motivating, right? So you need to be looking for feedback, and there's cognitive feedback, okay? There's affective feedback, how they're feeling about it, and there's cognitive feedback, right? How they're thinking about it. And so when I was living in Japan, there were a lot of people, because of the affective feedback that they feared I would be emotionally upset if they were to say anything, they wouldn't tell me that there was a problem. So different types of feedback that are involved here. All right, last issue, form-focused instruction. Form-focused instruction is not this metalinguistic explanation. I'm sorry, there is metalinguistic explanation. Form-focused instruction is where you're maybe talking about a material, you may be talking about or reading about something, and all of a sudden someone says, hey, what is this structure? What is this form in this reading, or in this story, or in this, you know, TV show? And all of a sudden everybody's now focused on the forms. Form-focused instruction years ago was not nearly as appreciated. Years ago was much more focused on the grammar translation method, and boom, that's all that was there. And people threw that away for a time during the audiolingual method, and even now in some who are involved in communicative language teaching, language learning, want to avoid using form-focused, even people in task-based language learning approach. But there is also great possibilities there. When people are interested, when they can focus on it and they see the practical value of that, it's a great opportunity to focus on the form. You can have a variety of ways to do this. You can have implicit language learning. You can have incidental noticing, the grammar consciousness raising. All of this stuff is not really the focus on the form, although you can focus on form, only it's more lightly. This one here is more direct. It's more explicit. It's more, hey, let's talk about grammar, right? Everybody's favorite subject. When you're doing language learning, there are some students who really want to learn that, so they are. Okay, some ways to treat errors. One way is to do a recast, okay? So like I did before, I go to the park. Oh, you went to the park? I cast that back to them. You might do a clarification request, which is, you know, I go to the park and then I say, I'm sorry, you what? I'm asking them a question, right? I'm sorry, can you say that again, right? You can give a meta-linguistic. You can actually explain it to them. Well, you know, I understand what you meant, but actually this is the way it's done, and you can give them an explanation, right? You can ask a question. I'm sorry, you can ask for a correction, right? You can say that. Can you say that again, please? Right? You missed that. Can you say that again, please? Right? That type of thing. You can, again, give them explicit request. I'm sorry, explicit correction. Actually tell them what type of error that they made. You can ask them to repeat, and this is something I often do. I'm sorry? Excuse me? Again, please? So that they try to notice. And actually, when you look at all these, that's what they're trying to do when you're dealing with error. You want them to notice the difference between what you're saying or what a native speaker is saying and what they're saying. You want them to notice the difference so that they can begin to copy the forms that you have. And so noticing is really what all this is for. Again, if they can handle the direct approach, fine, go right ahead and use it. If they can't, if you're overloading them, this is why you as a teacher need to be watching that affective filter. Make sure that it doesn't get too high or it doesn't get too low. So if they notice, they can self-repair. If someone else can tell them, obviously it's a peer repair, teacher repair, every different ways where you can encourage people to help the corrections, right? And that's all for this chapter. I do thank you for listening. If you do have questions or problems, please let me know, and I'll talk